Do you like a deck that can win through multiple avenues, yet scales with the skill and experience of the player? Is it satisfying setting up card, mana and interactive engines that are a struggle for your opponents to interrupt? Do you enjoy drawing cards and resolving triggers? Lots and lots of triggers? Then it may be time to check out the Orzhov queen herself, Teysa Karlov. Let's start by looking at what Teysa does. Teysa Karlov is a 2/4 human advisor that costs 2 colourless, a black and a white. She reads, if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Also, creature tokens you control have vigilance and lifelink. So from that we can see that Teysa wants to reward us for our creatures dying, specifically creatures with triggered effects, and if we make tokens, she wants to enhance them by giving them vigilance and lifelink. Lucky for us, those two abilities aren't mutually exclusive and we can make use of both to great effect. But one of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, how are we going to win? Well, starting with our drain effects, we have Cruel Celebrant, Zulaport Cutthroat and Meathook Massacre. Both Cruel Celebrant and Zulaport Cutthroat will have us gaining a life and our opponents losing a life every time any one of our creatures dies, and importantly this doesn't specify tokens, so they will trigger this too. With Teysa out, however, this effect will trigger twice, essentially doubling the life gain and loss respectively. Meathook Massacre works a little differently to the previous two, only losing a life when our creatures die and gaining a life when our opponent's creatures die, but the life loss on our creatures is more important for closing out the game. This effect is also attached to an enchantment, which means it's harder for our opponents to remove. Perhaps most important of all, it can act as a board wipe when needed, where for 2 black and X, all creatures get -X until end of turn. With the right board setup, this can bring our life total back to a healthy amount or simply win the game outright. We also have Altar of Dementia, which acts as a sack outlet in addition to a win con for this deck. Every creature we sacrifice mills a player based on that creature's power. In the early game we can mill ourselves because we have a recursion package in the deck that we will discuss later, but in the late game, if we get one of our many token generators online with this, it isn't too hard to mill at least one opponent out and all of them if the engine is fully online. Speaking of token generators, that makes a nice segue into our creature-based win con, combat damage with many vigilant and lifelink tokens. Although we have many token generators, our most powerful ones that can close out a game in one turn are Teysa, Orzhov Scion, Elenda the Dusk Rose, and Requiem Angel. Teysa makes 1/1 spirit tokens with flying every time any black creature dies, including tokens. Elenda makes X 1/1 vampires with lifelink based on her power when she dies, and although they lack the evasion of the spirit tokens, important when trying to close the game out, she will generally make them at a higher rate because she gets +1/+1 counters on her every time any creature dies, including our opponents. With Teysa out, Elenda will double both the counters she receives from creatures dying, as well as the amount of tokens she makes when she dies. Requiem Angel will make us 1/1 white spirits with flying every time a non-spirit we control dies, so essentially we'll be making spirits every time most of our creatures die, including tokens. With Teysa out and any of these three on board, it isn't hard on the end step before your turn to sack enough creatures to have a massive token army ready to take out your opponents. So now that we've discussed our win cons, how are we going to get there? Let's discuss our card advantage package. To start off with, we have Esper Sentinel, which says that whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, we draw unless they pay X, where X is its power. This is a cheap body that can easily draw a number of cards throughout the game and act as sack fodder when we no longer need it. Most importantly though, if we do need it, being a creature means our recursion cards can get it back into play. Priest of Forgotten Gods only draws us 1 card per turn, but because it also generates 2 black mana and makes opponents sacrifice a creature, all for the cost of sacking 2 of our creatures, it is worth the limitation. Grim Haruspex draws us a card every time another non-token creature of ours dies, and Midnight Reaper does the same, except we lose life each time and it draws a card upon its own death. Morbid Opportunist limits the cards drawn to once per turn, so Teysa cannot double these triggers, but the fact it is any creature means if we have a sack outlet and some tokens out, we can draw up to 4 cards per rotation cycle. Not only this, but this also includes the death of our opponent's creatures, so this can draw cards incidentally because creatures are constantly dying throughout a normal game. Necropotence is simply one of the best card draw engines in the game in decks that can run it, those decks being ones with enough devotion to black and preferably an ability to gain life. This deck meets both those requirements. Yawgmoth Thran Physician serves multiple roles by acting as a sack outlet and creature removal piece in addition to its card draw ability. Yawgmoth doesn't care about tokens or non-tokens, only that there are enough bodies and we have bodies to spare. Smothering Abomination allows us to draw cards whenever we sacrifice creatures, and like Yawgmoth, we'll draw cards from tokens. It also has added utility by requiring us to sacrifice a creature on upkeep, which is actually useful if we don't have a sack outlet on board yet. Dark Prophecy is an enchantment that draws us a card at the cost of 1 life every time any of our creatures die. And don't forget that these effects are doubled if Teysa is out. Erebos the Bleak-Hearted is a hard to remove enchantment or enchantment creature, depending on our devotion, that draws us a card at the cost of 2 life whenever a creature of ours dies. It also has a sack outlet, albeit at a cost, which can remove any low toughness utility creatures that our opponents own. Another great benefit of Erebos is that when he becomes a creature, the indestructibility and good power toughness stats make it a great blocker until all our engines are online. Plumb the Forbidden is a low cost instant that reads, draw a card and lose 1 life, but as an additional cost for each creature we sacrifice, we can copy this spell that many times. So in the early game, we are typically drawing at least 2 to 3 cards, but in the mid to late game, this can vary anywhere from 4 to 7 cards for only 2 mana. Skullclamp is probably the best card draw source we have in the deck, where for an equip cost of 1, we can draw 2 cards upon the equipped creature dying, but with Teysa out, this is 4 cards per creature. With even half the engine online, having Skullclamp out should quickly dig us to the cards we need to close the game out. Finally, we have Bolas's Citadel. This powerful artifact lets us cast cards from the top of our library at the cost per CMC of the casted card. With Teysa giving lifelink and vigilance to our tokens on top of our drain effects, we should have a healthy life total to take full advantage of its effect. And so powerful is it that just resolving it can mean the end of the game for our opponents. The only thing stopping Citadel is hitting lands on the top of our library, but with the card draw power of this deck, we should easily be able to filter any lands off top. And if you get this out with Necropotence, well, victory is almost assured, as we can just pay 1 life using Necro to get the lands off top as they appear. Another often forgotten benefit of Bolas's Citadel, but not lost on this deck, is its second ability to sack 10 non-land permanents so each opponent loses 10 life. Sometimes it's just the answer we need if we run out of life to keep casting things from the top of our library. So now that we've covered how we're going to be gaining so much card advantage, let's see how we're going to be gaining the mana to use those cards. First up is Loyal Warhound, who tutors up a basic plains to the battlefield tapped, provided an opponent has more lands than we do. Knight of the White Orchid also tutors up a land, but it can be any plains and it enters the battlefield untapped. Importantly though, they provide bodies to be sacrificed for value at a later time. Pawn of Ulamog makes 0/1 Eldrazi Scions with sacrifice this creature, add 1 colorless mana for each non-token creature we control that dies, turning our non-token creatures' deaths into colorless mana rituals. Sifter of Skulls does the same, except making 1/1 Eldrazi Scions instead. Even more powerful is Pitiless Plunderer, who not only makes treasure tokens upon creatures' deaths, much more powerful and relevant to this deck which can be quite color hungry, but it also triggers off of token creatures as well. Teysa and Plunderer very easily allow storm turns to occur, and you will almost certainly be able to cast anything in your hand with these 2 out. Ashnod's Altar makes 2 colorless mana from a sacrificed creature, serving double duty as a mana accelerant and sack outlet. Phyrexian Altar is the same, except it makes 1 mana of any color for each creature sacrificed. Resolving either will quickly fix you of any mana issues. Crowded Crypt is a 3 mana rock that adds 1 black mana, a rate we are not normally happy to pay for an artifact, but this also has a secondary win con attached to it. You see, it has a static ability that says, whenever a creature you control dies, and that's the key, creature, not non-token creature, put a corpse counter on it, and if we pay 2 black and 4 colorless to sack it, we make X 2/2 decayed zombies, where X is the number of corpse counters on this. It may not seem like it at first glance, but it isn't hard to put 4 to 8 counters on this per turn when Teysa is out. And just remember that when decayed zombies attack, they sacrifice themselves at end of combat, so they will also trigger any death triggers regardless of whether you have a sack outlet or not. Black Market is a powerhouse in this deck, where for every creature that dies, you add a charge counter to it. Again, not caring about non-tokens, which is important. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, for each charge counter on it, you add 1 black mana. With the amount of creatures we have dying, don't be surprised to untap with this the next turn, generating at least 4 to 8 mana. If you keep it around, well, the highest I've seen it go to is 65, but it isn't unexpected to have averaging 20 to 30 mana over a few turns. This is a kill on-site card for your opponents. And that's our mana acceleration. Now I know some of you are thinking that's not a lot, but don't worry, we have some cool tech that I'll go over later that can actually incidentally accelerate our mana. So we know how we're drawing cards and gaining mana, but how are we interacting with our opponents? Well, we are firstly starting with a sorcery, Rite of Oblivion. By sacrificing a non-land permanent, something we can easily do, we are able to exile any problematic non-land permanents. It also has the ability to be flashed back for the cost of 2 colourless, a black and a white, which is something to be valued highly. Cathar Commando can be sacrificed for 1 colourless to destroy an artifact or enchantment, but it also has the niche use of being able to be flashed in to block a problematic creature, hopefully killing it. The fact it sacrifices itself has great synergy with many other cards we run. Douthie Voidwalker keeps other graveyard decks in check by exiling any cards that hit the graveyard, but its incredible ability to be able to play the cards it exiles means we have access to cards we need at the right time, as well as cards we couldn't normally play in our colours. And our small suite of Recursion in the deck means we can hopefully keep getting use out of Douthie's ability. Grave Pact and Dictate of Erebos both make our opponents sacrifice a creature every time one of our creatures dies, but with Teysa out this doubles, meaning you will essentially have a permanent one-sided board wipe effect until your opponents get rid of them. Junji, the Midnight Sky, attacks our opponents on 2 fronts, either making them discard 4 cards and losing 4 life when it dies with Teysa out, or reanimating 2 non-dragon creatures. And just remember, because these triggers are doubled, not copied, you can change which mode you choose. Live in Death serves as a board wipe that, because it requires the creatures are sacrificed, gets around indestructible effects. But the real reason why we play it is for the reanimation effect. In response to casting this, you sacrifice whatever creatures you have on board, so you bring everything back to the battlefield, while your opponents lose everything they have. The Meat Hook Massacre, as discussed earlier, is a board wipe in addition to a win condition for the deck, getting around indestructible because the creatures are getting -X until end of turn. Vindictive Lish, like Junji, attacks each opponent on multiple fronts, where when it dies, one opponent sacrifices 2 creatures, another discards 4 cards, and the last loses 10 life with Teysa out. If we recur this, it isn't long until our opponents are either dead or out of answers. Yosei, the Morning Star, can softlock our opponents by making 2 of them not be able to untap their permanents next turn, while also tapping up to 5 permanents they currently have. Recurring Yosei also spells big trouble for our opponents. So far we've discussed all these benefits we get from our creatures dying, but just how are we going to kill them? Let's discuss our sack outlets. We have already discussed Altar of Dementia, Ashnod's Altar, Phyrexian Altar and Yawgmoth for their utility elsewhere, but it bears mentioning again that they are great sack outlets, especially because they are free and repeatable, attributes we value highly in this deck. Next up is Carrion Feeder, a 1-drop that gains counters for each creature sacrificed. Viscera is also a 1-drop free sack outlet, but scries instead. Cartel Aristocrat gains protection from the colour of your choice when sacking creatures, not irrelevant when facing down a large non-trampling creature. Martyr's Cause is a very underrated sack outlet that gives protection from all damage from one source every time you sacrifice a creature. You will be surprised how often this becomes relevant and how often it will save you. So that's most of our sack outlets. Now let's have a look at what we'll be typically sacking or gaining sack fodder from to gain all this value. Doomed Traveller, Garrison Cat, Hunted Witness, Nested Shambler and Carrier Thrall are all cheap creatures that create a body upon dying. 2 if Teysa is out, providing cheap fuel for the engine. Bloodghast can re-enter the battlefield from a graveyard every time a land enters the battlefield, providing a free and recurable form of sack fodder. Nether Trader can re-enter from the graveyard, provided we pay 1 black every time a creature of ours dies, and Reassembling Skeleton can do so at any time, provided we pay a black and a colourless. Ophiomancer generates a 1/1 black snake with Death Touch every player's turn, provided we don't control any snake on said player's upkeep. This provides a large amount of value when we have a sack outlet on board with another card that cares about any creature dying. Finally, we have Blight Mound that creates 1/1 pests upon non-token creatures dying, with when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So not only does Teysa double the amount of pests made, but when these pests die, we gain 2 life per pest instead of 1. In addition, Blight Mound also has a static ability that gives those pests +1, +0 and menace. So, in a pinch, we can use those pest tokens aggressively if we need the life gain or to reduce an opponent's life total. So now that we've seen nearly all the deck's creatures and the value they provide, we want ways to be able to recur those abilities. So let's take a look at our recursion package. Priest of Fell Rites can tap, pay 3 life and sacrifice itself to return any creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield, all at the cost of 2 mana. Not only this, but for 3 colourless, a black and a white mana, we can unearth it to do it 1 more time. Phyrexian Reclamation is a 1-mana enchantment that can return any creature from our graveyard to our hands at the cost of only 1 colourless and a black mana and 2 life. Recurring pieces such as Douthie Voidwalker, Pitiless Plunderer, or Cruel Celebrant keeps us posing a threat the whole game. Prowling Geistcatcher exiles any creatures we sacrifice and gains +1/+1 counters if those creatures were tokens. But when it leaves, all creatures exiled with it return to the battlefield. So we essentially get twice the value from our death triggers that are doubled already with Teysa. Luminous Broodmoth works in a similar way, but returns any creatures that died without flying to the battlefield with flying counters on them. With all these creatures dying, including our opponents, Command the Dreadhorde is a powerful reanimation effect that can potentially be game-winning. We can choose any number of creatures or planeswalkers in all graveyards and reanimate them at the cost of being dealt damage equal to their mana values. The life gain effect Teysa provides our tokens, as well as our drain effects, should ensure we can cast this for a healthy amount of life. Brought Back is a 2-mana instant that can return up to 2 permanents that were put into our graveyard our turn. Note how it says permanents. So if we sacrifice some fetch lands and cast this, we can return those fetch lands to the battlefield tapped, essentially ramping 1 to 2 lands. So early game, this card actually acts as a ramp piece, but mid to late game, we can recur powerful permanents with death triggers or protect those key pieces from removal, especially artifacts and enchantments like Skullclamp or Grave Pact. Faith's Reward is a 4-mana version of this effect, except it brings back all permanents put in a graveyard that turn. Because of its cost, it is more a mid to late game piece, but we can still use the land ramp trick here in addition to recurring other valuable permanents for repeated death triggers and effects. Sevin's Reclamation can return any permanent with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard back to the battlefield, and Flashback for 5 can do this twice. But again, if needed, we can use this for ramp, recurring a fetch land. Gift of Immortality is an aura that says when enchanted creature dies, return it to the battlefield, and return Gift of Immortality attached to that creature at the beginning of the next end step. Imagine equipping Junji, Vindictive Leash, or Yosai the Morning Star with this, getting 4 death triggers per turn cycle. Even without Teysa on the battlefield, that is nasty, but if she is out, oof. So, let's finish up by examining some important lands for the deck. Agadeem's Awakening can be an untapped land when needed, but mid to late game can reanimate the creatures we need to close out the game. Amiria's Call can also be played untapped, and acts as a plan B to swing in for combat damage if the situation calls for it. Phyrexian Tower is a sack outlet and ramp piece, providing us 2 black mana every time we sack a creature. It works particularly well with token makers like Ophiomancer or easily recurable creatures like Bloodghast to ensure we always get the extra mana. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is another land that can generate huge amounts of mana because most of our non-land cards are actually permanents. The deck's devotion is also largely black, meaning Nykthos will often act as a repeatable black mana ritual for us. High Market serves as a sack outlet for redundancy, and Volrath's Stronghold can help us recur the key creatures we need to keep our opponents in check. Lastly, Malakir Rebirth can either be played as a tap land, or it can either act as protection or allow us to generate additional death triggers by returning a creature that dies to the battlefield. The rest of the lands are there to fix colours, but we also run a large number of fetch lands to help with cards like Brought Back, Faith Rewards, and Sevin's Reclamation. Teysa is a really enjoyable deck to play, and it rewards the player who properly sequences and times their plays. It isn't uncommon for this deck to have an unseemingly threatening board state, but then one more piece lands and the deck chains off to victory. So if you've been looking to try an Aristocrats deck that is fun, layered, and powerful, Teysa still reigns supreme. Well, that's it guys. If you want to see the deck in action, make sure to swing by the channel where there will be some games up so you can see how the deck performs in the wild. Until next time.